Good afternoon. Let us hope to find some alchemical gold. Let us first start with a quote from Christopher Marlowe's famous play, Faust. "Stand still, you ever-moving spheres of heaven, that time may cease and midnight never come. Fair nature's eyes, rise, rise again, and make perpetual day." Marlowe alludes to the all-too-human desire for eternity and perpetual life. A desire unattainable, and maybe just because of this, an all-too-human desire. Equally, it was the old alchemical dream to attain the elixir of life, or the panacea, the all-healing potion. In this lecture, we will focus on the structure of the alchemical process and how this connects to the meandering mysteries of art itself. Let us juxtapose this with a claim on real eternity. Here you see the image from the old cave of forgotten dreams, as Werner Herzog called it. The Altamira, Lascaux and Chauvet, they are the oldest paintings known to mankind, like inscriptions of lost times when mankind was just searching its way into existence. Picasso liked these also. He apparently once said that après Altamira tout est décadence. After Altamira all is decadence. Was the Catalan master referring to the aftermath of the World War, or was he more convinced these cave paintings tell us something about the current state man has brought himself ever since civilization started? Mankind as a civilized but oh so sick animal, as if language, science and knowledge did not only give us power over our surroundings, but took away our primitive state, one that was closer to the essential core of existence. Let us turn towards the analysis of Georges Bataille, a French philosopher, novelist, and according to some, a mere pornographer. He presents another trail of thought. In his perception, the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira were none other than brutal depictions of transgression, always irrational and violent. He saw these paintings in a general culture of religion in its most purest and, according to him, most brutal form, consisting of war, hunting and sacrifice. On the picture we clearly can see the bison with an arrow in its side, and in front of it a hunter is seen wearing some kind of bird mask or bird head with an erect phallus. For Bataille, the meaning of this was all too clear. In his opinion, these paintings contained a sacred element. They were made after the hunt as a kind of reconciliation with reality. The prehistoric hunt itself was an act of unbound brutality, blood and death. The paintings depicted this, illustrating the controllability and, at the same time, transcending any form of rationality. According to Bataille, these cave paintings were created in an atmosphere of expiation and reconciliation with everyday life. Briefly put, they are attempts at returning to everyday normality. In his perception, we may consider the paintings as a kind of monument of past horror, of physical and mental transgression. They are an expression of past exuberance and passionate self-loss, a way to depict the unnameable, of putting the unfathomable violence, cruelty and mystical exaltation into a containable form and shape. Bataille, roughly stated, described these two poles of existence throughout his whole oeuvre. On the one side there is normal life, directed by a modus of individuality, singularity, and defined by personal choice and a certain degree of rationality. On the other hand, as Bataille named it, there is a transgression. This is fairly simply put. Transgression can also easily be determined as a kind of a revolt, characterized by non-individuality and a continuum. It is both erotic and religious. For Bataille, these two were interconnected. In his dualistic system, transgression is contradicted by individuality, rationality, and subjectivity. In my opinion, it is fruitful to consider both science and religion within a similar distinction. Correspondingly, one could see transcultural mystical experience as transgressive, and on the other hand, opposed to this, the dogmas, the formality of rituals and or theology. Also, as regarding to science, one could consider the ideas of Thomas Kuhn on scientific revolutions with, on the one hand, fundamental scientific paradigm-shifting research, as on the more transgressive part, while what he called the puzzle-solving or the normal science could be positioned on the other side. Without here further elaborating on this, I would like to show another well-known 19th century sculpture by Fougère. A typical iconography of the devil is here the melancholy one. Here we see a detailed photo. It was taken from the internet, so this is the photographer. One notices the typical iconography of the melancholy, of the chin resting in the palm of the hand. A romantic depiction often encountered in the 19th century, reminding us on the one hand of Marlowe's Faust, as he put it, the one who ordered the ever-moving spheres of heaven to perpetual day, as well as it brings to mind Milton's poetry, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. The devilish wings serve here as a shield against the strong and heavenly white light. The depiction of Satan or the devil as a fallen hero of revolt is a common image ever since the Renaissance in Western culture. It re-emerged during the 19th century and it is still alive to this day in the Gothic culture. The historical connection dates back to the old Greeks where Socrates, the daimon, was the force within him as he described it on many occasions. A force which he could not resist and which ultimately led him to say no to the proposed escape route after his being condemned to death. Just to think about the demonic and the force it contains seems at face value quite contradictory, especially when one focuses on the experience of the demonic, bearing into mind Bataille's opinion on the transgressive experience. The demonic is mainly associated with a lack of reason or anarchy. The demonic also means a lack of moderation, of what nowadays would be called a common sense. It's interesting to see how well and easy the alchemical tradition fits into all of this. All too often, the demonic has been used as a swearing word by members of institutionalized religion. Alchemists such as Arnoldus de Villanova, Agrippa von Nettesheim or Paracelsus were, at one time or another, accused of being affiliated with the dark and or daimonic magic. Here we have a painting from 19th century, again, from a Belgian painter, Félicien Rops. A magician sitting next to an alchemical vessel, situated here. And he makes a succubus appear out of the mirror, or the spiculum in Latin. It might well be an image of Dr. Faustus. Faustus easily ties all the knots together of alchemy, daimonical transgression, melancholy and revolt. Turning back on what has previously been said, it can easily be perceived that Faust is one of the most daimonic historical persona to have ever existed in Western culture, truly possessed by the forces from beyond. He is striving for knowledge in a rebellious state of mind, one of the most famous alchemists who ever lived. When looking at the Faust, historical figure, character of Marlowe's play or Goethe, whether a Renaissance magus or a romantic figure, one constant element is his drive towards resistance, not only against the laws of nature, but even more against the way humanity or mankind has to abide to the laws of nature. But even more against, that's it. To single it out, Faust has a transgressive nature. The history of alchemy always shows a kind of chameleontic tradition. The alchemist, he adapts to his surroundings, makes idealized promises, copies the desire of the patron, but ultimately follows his own path. It is a structural relationship that not only defines the relationship between an artist and his or her patron. The relationship of seduction, manipulation, can also be seen as a relationship between an artist and art itself. In my opinion, artists always have felt an inclination towards the transgressive desire. To exist and create from the great beyond must necessarily originate from a frame of the extraordinary. Interesting, again, to see are the structural similarities between the alchemical process and the frame of mind so essential in an artist's creative process. Equally, for the alchemists as for the artist, a state of destruction needs to be established before a new position can be installed. If we look at this photograph, taken from a performance of the Wiener Aktionisten, that's, I think, 50s or 60s, one is easily persuaded of this. Here we see the act of creative self-destruction as the creative act itself. One can also refer to Wagner's first three operas, deconstructing the opera tradition before making his first real Wagner opera. It is, of course, tempting to associate in the same trail of thought the ideology of fascism and Nazism. To a certain degree, this is right. The concept of the destruction as a part of an idealized promise of salvation one encounters, for instance, in the work of Anselm Kiefer. Here, Kiefer shows the golden circle as a reference to the Zephirot, in Jewish mystical perfection, and it's floating above the railway to a concentration camp. Here we see another painting from Kiefer, the devastation of a burned down and bombed village, linked to the Nigredo phase, that's the title of the painting, a phase of destruction, or primary phase of destruction in alchemy. Kiefer uses the symbols of alchemy and the Holocaust in order to evoke the dark and masculine perspective of alchemy. A big distinction from this discourse is that the Faustian artist or alchemist is a solitary figure, working out his idiosynchronized project in solitary confinement. 17th century. The Belgian painter David Teniers, famous for his alchemical labs. A lot of studies have considered this work as a typical, or his work in general, as a typical genre painting, which depicts an ironic and critic position of the artist towards the alchemical work. I would like to emphasize the ambivalence at the heart of Teniers' painting, as he is making a self-portrait as alchemist at the end of his life. It's a very typical paradox one often encounters when looking deeper into the structure and logic of the alchemical creation. Some of the greatest alchemists were against alchemy, like many artists who have proclaimed that art is dead. We already alluded to the role destruction plays in the process of the Faustian alchemical artist. We also infer that for the artist, the transgressive phase almost always involves a degree of self-destructiveness. Let us now examine how the ambiguity of the paradox is at work in the whole process. When focusing on the transgressive nature, however different the outcome of the work may be, a certain pattern or structure seems to emerge. One is even tempted to see it as an ontological structure, whereby the person tries to regain a certain amount of control after the transgressive experience. Simply put, one might call it a matter of mental recovery. After the inner daimon or demon has had its way, it's not unlikely to have the mental response in the search for a kind of, or a form of meaning to the experience. So we go back to the initial scheme. One can see the framing of an experience as an attempt of regaining control. This can be understood very literally in a psychological perspective, when drawing and painting itself are a kind of reconciliation, like the cave paintings after the hunt. In my opinion, art itself has never changed. It's a certain existential search in between transgression and the well-established language games. In this regard, one could even compare it to negative theology or fundamental scientific research. As has been historically proven, this want for control over the uncontrollable plays a fundamental part in the history of magic and its connection to science, whether it is considered black or white. Magic always seems to be connected to the realm of the beyond, not unlike the work of the alchemists. This is made more clear in the example of another Dr. Faustus book. The Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann had a particular scene in the Dr. Faustus where the music composer or the main character meets the devil halfway through the book in a villa in the Tuscan hills. The composer is making fun of the devil, who is taking on different shapes to seduce him, and the composer asks the devil whether he thinks he's stupid. The composer knows the history of the devil, and he's not about to sell his soul. But the devil in turn smiles, and he tells the artist his compelling secret. Don't you think people in the past did not see through my tricks? They weren't stupid either. You think you are exceptional? The truth is you are like me, and you're not afraid of hell. In fact, you detest heaven, a place full of peace and quiet with nothing to do. No, you prefer hell, great passions, never-ending tragedies, everlasting fire, not unlike the sufferings you put yourself through while you live the artist life. So the devil the composer, is in the end persuaded to sell his soul. But what does he gain? The ultimate dream of every artist, to make immortal pieces of artwork. So, to be recognized as genius. Throughout the novel, every time the composer is in search for a new idea for a masterpiece, he is overwhelmed by intense self-destructive melancholy. And by the end of his life and the end of the novel, he almost dies preparing to make his ultimate magnum opus. Like the swan, the greatest work by which he will live on is the one he makes staring death in the eye. One will have noticed that the appeal the devil made to the artist alchemist is that of a promise of a specific kind of eternity and timelessness. How can this be understood? If we return to the cave paintings of Altamira and Lascaux, not this one of course, on the verge of the human culture, and let us compare it to a distinction one can make concerning the Manierist tradition. Although this period in art history has been point of controversy, it is clear that the 16th century, in which it flourished in Florence, in Italy, as well as in the north, was a time where the courts all over Europe were flooding with spiritual as well as practical alchemy. The secret discipline was widely known and practiced. The difference, which is often made between Manierist paintings, whether they had a methodic approach or not, is often the essence for a distinction. Again, we like to bear in mind the difference between the transgression and the language games. On the one hand, Manierist paintings working from a disegno interno or inner design. Here the artist takes the starting point from within as a kind of inner Platonic vision that lights up his mind and leads the ultimate drive towards the artwork. This is the example, Bronzino, the allegory of Venus, Cupid, folly and time. A certain incestuous allegory of Cupid and Venus surrounded by time and madness. On top you see Saturn, that's like the god for time, also associated with melancholy. And when one looks closer into the details, you can see the arm of Saturn, a disproportional to a certain even surreal extent. On the whole, this kind of Manierism can be interpreted as a revolt against the naturalistic tendencies of high and late Renaissance. In this Manierist tradition, the painter did no longer follow the nature or his senses, but a kind of inner design, giving to him by a daimonic force, not unlike the Socratic one, always ordering to revolt. Contrary to this, the methodic Manierist painters did not feel or were not able to get in touch with this kind of inner force, which led them ultimately to imitate the more inspired colleagues. For instance, Vasari. Here we see a painting. He was an art critic, well-known art critic from the time, which again exemplifies that critics and artists are not well mixed. The painting is in the Palazzo della Cancelleria, when he proudly pronounced that he finished it in only 100 days. Michelangelo claimed to have responded, "Yes, it shows you finished it in 100 days." Vasari was actually no exception, because the Manierist style was often resulting into a kind of ridiculously disproportionate imagery or painting or sculpting. So it leaves out all kinds of marks from spirit or daimonic force from within. This, in my opinion, is an essential frame of thought in order to consider the value of the alchemical paradigm. Alchemy, whether allegorical, spiritual, or very practical, always follows the same kind of path. It always starts in search for primary matter, also called prima materia, and in order to attain this, a destruction of the existing matter is necessary in order to get rid of the superfluous. Kiefer's paintings illustrate this very well, as we have seen. When moving further beyond this stage of destruction, also called nigredo or the making black, there follows a moment of spiritualization. This may, for the sake of the argument, be interpreted as a form of excess and or self-loss of individuality. Why so? It's in fact a point hard to describe in time and place when matter itself is transformed into spirit. The freeing of that which was burned inside, as many alchemical manuscripts describe it. The alchemists had different names for this stage, but it always referred to the moment in the process when the air or the spirit was set forth from matter. It was even of value in the history of scientific alchemy when, for instance, Van Helmont discovered the state of matter now known as gas. Of course, there are many different named stages in the alchemical process, more than we can account for here. Elkins, for instance, he wrote an analogy between the act of painting and that of the alchemical processes. Interesting to see is that the ultimate stages all boil down to turning matter into spirit and vice versa. It's not that much of a surprise if one is to consider the limited amounts of movement able to occur in an alchemical vessel or an ambix. This fairly simple process of turning matter into spirit and spirit into matter, it's a circular motion, proved ample enough inspiration for more than one philosopher, scientist, alchemist, artist or spiritual mind, leading the creative minds into the most far-fetched associations, as Jung amply illustrated. You want a glass of water? Okay. The eventual goal, however, has never altered. It is the moment when the philosopher's stone is gained. Often in Renaissance alchemy, this end has been compared to the incarnation or the reincarnation, as it was seen a kind of redemption of nature. Not unlike the moment and place when the alchemist and the artist take the place of Christ or the Redeemer of matter. Here we see Albrecht Dürer, German painter and etcher. He was familiar with the practice of alchemy for the etching technique. And he depicted himself when he was 28 years old as Christ. Another example, for instance, is the Belgian alchemist Dorneus, who wrote that God needed to be redeemed by mankind. There were alchemists who compared the alchemical furnace with the tabernacle. Some saw God as the great alchemist. Remarkable is, however, as has been written, that this state of redemption happens within the alchemist as well as the matter he or she works with. The essential symbol or the signifier for this place of transformation is the ambix. It's called the alchemical vessel or the vas mirabile in Latin, the miracle barrel. It is both an instrument as well as a kind of symbolic representation. This is a picture taken from a Heidelberg museum. The concept behind the instrument of the ambix dates back to the old cosmology of Plato. So in his book, the Timaeus, he describes how God, or the demiurge, creates from the vessel. The soul of man equally comes from this instrument by means of spiritualization, probably. The theme itself was picked up in the Renaissance by Lazzarelli, who turned it around and described how man could construct gods out of the hermetic vessel of his own mind. The creative aspect of this instrument was underlined by the often sexualized iconography which was connected to it. The krater, which is Greek for vessel, was compared to, for instance, the bed on a wedding night, or even to a uterus. Sendivogius compared it to the gates of Venus locking the sacred garden. Sexual connotations make it all the more plausible to connect it to Bataille's ideas of transgression. The alchemical image of two elderly men feeding on the breasts of the Virgin or a woman menstruating in a circle of wisdom leave little to the imagination. I didn't bring the pictures. But instead of focusing on these images, it proves more valuable, in my opinion, to put them in a historical perspective. An interesting point of notice, for instance, is Plato's notes on the symbol of the uterus, where he describes the metaphysical point where being connects to becoming. The point of creation, that's what it could be called. In Greek it reads as the chora. It's a place that is neither being nor becoming, but something in between. the structure of the idea, it can easily be applied to both alchemical images. They make the idea more understandable, as even Plato literally says in the text, this concept is very hard to understand. Anyway, it brings all of this brings to mind a very intriguing connection in relation to time and creativity. A connection that leads us to understand the kind of everlasting time that both an artist and an alchemist strive for. Let me just say for now that this double structure of time is equally at hand in melancholy. It's a state of mind that has a tradition as old as our Western civilization. From the ancient Greeks on, it has been connected to both alchemy and the creative mind and arts. So without further elaborating on the temporal parameters of creation, it is, however, fruitful to see how time itself not only plays a part in the creation of work of art, but also on the artist himself. The reciprocity of art and artists we also encounter between the alchemist and his work. Let us turn again on the distinction within Manierist art. As we explained before, while most of the Manierists were methodically playing out the lines and curves of matter, others were trying to bring a disegno interno, or an inner design, to life. In the latter case, itself reflects onto the one who created it, opening up a specific time dimension. Here we come to the core of the alchemical and the creative experience. In the writings of Albertus Magnus, medieval monk and alchemist, one encounters a specific kind of time experience described as a nunc stans, or an eternal now. It is time that moves like a timeless image of eternity. Kierkegaard called it the atom of eternity, and it's also amply quoted in Japanese religious philosophy on Zen. It's a kind of mystical moment when the mind is brought into matter, and when the transgressive experience proves a fruitful soil to reconstruct matter as well as oneself. Melting together mind and matter, subject and object, self and work. Whether it is in a text, an image, or an object, so that by this reformation of matter, text, image, and object are in a kind of reshaping, reshaped to a form that is grander and less vulnerable to time and space. That is what the creative act is all about. And if this work can then, in turn, be the mirror whereby the viewer and or the listener is able to join in, only then true transformation can occur of that which is called reality. Thank you.